your host, Aileen Peterson, a traditional midwife, healer, herbalist, and Ancestral Earthskills guide providing holistic, full-spectrum, community-based support from cradle to grave. This podcast is about remembering ancestral wisdom for healing and whole body well-being, reconnecting to earth-based lifeways through traditional skills and land connection, and reclaiming our sovereignty by rewilding our health, birth, and parenting. My work and these transmissions are spiritual, radical, and anarchist explorations of the depths of our primal nature and how to reconnect with our ancient lineages and birthright of wholeness, health, autonomy, and a magical wild life rooted in connection to land, spirit, and community. It is for those yearning for an older, deeper, wilder way to navigate the late-stage capitalist landscape of the Anthropocene age while supporting ourselves and our communities regeneratively within and beyond the systems we live in. We are decolonizing, revillaging, rematriating, remembering, and reclaiming together. This is for the folk remembering their wildness. Be sure to subscribe to our Substack and to the podcast on Apple Podcasts to get notified when new episodes are released and access to episode transcripts and additional resources. You can subscribe for free, but by joining our paid Substack tier for $5 a month, your financial contribution acts like a Patreon and helps us to create this content for you. You'll also get access to exclusive content not available anywhere else online, all archived Substack posts, and occasional freebies. A little note about language before we dive into today's episode. I am a queer woman who identifies with and uses both feminine and gender-neutral or non-binary language for myself, and I work with others who have various gender identities. The language that I use in this podcast is fluid, and I will go back and forth between utilizing gendered and non-gendered language, depending on the topic, source, and experience or experiencer. Please feel free to replace any gender-identifying terms with those that align more with yourself if needed when reading or listening to my publications. Today's episode is exploring my own personal experience of and the potential application of psychedelic therapies and somatic experiencing for birth story mythmending and birth trauma resolution. Content trigger warnings for today's episode include the use of psychedelic mushroom medicine, birth trauma, and infant loss. You can read the transcript for this episode in its original Substack post at barewomanwisdom.substack.com. I had been working with psilocybin medicine for the treatment of a severe anxiety disorder for a couple of weeks when something amazing happened. One morning, I took my mushroom microdose for the day, upping it to 0.2 grams, the most I'd done up to that point, but it was a mix of cap, mostly, and stem. I made my cacao milk with the raw goat milk I milked myself from my soft-dyed dough, pouring it just boiled over the pieces of mushroom, and added a dropperful of reishi tincture as I had done the last 2 weeks. Within maybe 10 minutes of eating the mushrooms, I felt the effects begin to set in. I then felt the anxiety begin to build and rise and began to become air hungry, just as I had noticed 2 days prior when I had taken my last dose, which had been an increase from 0.1 gram to 0.18 gram. Like that day, I felt like I needed to stim and shake out what was rising in my body. It suddenly clicked. This wasn't just anxiety, either my own day-to-day anxiety exacerbated by the mushrooms, as can happen when you come up and dose too fast, nor the, oh no, I'm high, anxiety I often get with initial consumption of any mind-altering substance I might consume. This was trauma surfacing. This was my body, with the help of the mushroom medicine, stirring up trauma stored in my tissues and my nervous system that was asking to be released, like when massage releases trapped toxins from the muscles that flow into the bloodstream. The other day when I had felt this, I had intuitively taken out my bull kelp medicine rattles and worked them in a toroidal or donut-shaped energy pattern around my body, shaking both my body, or stimming, and filling the immediate space around me and my sensory or sound hearing input with the rattling while swaying my body back and forth and from side to side in my hips. But this time, as I shook the rattles and began to sway my hips, I started to feel something else, something different arise in my body. It had been so long ago now, but I suddenly realized what was rising in my body, blooming from my hips and sacrum, a contraction. Suddenly, a guttural moan erupted from my lips, and I folded at the waist over my window seat where I had been standing, looking out the window at the trees as I rattled and swayed. A wave of emotions moved through me, and I began to cry-moan through the waves of labor. I focused my breath and my moan deep in the chest and down into my belly. I felt the familiar ache in my sacrum, and I just wanted to move and release it. I leaned forward, pressing into my forearms and releasing my low back, cry-moaning into the buffalo fur draped over the window seat, and swung my hips back and forth. This was the guttural moan of the point in labor where the baby enters the birth canal. I realized then that I was rebirthing my son. After a few moments here, the pressure built too much in my sacrum, and I dropped into a deep, flat-footed squat. I began to cry and moan, tears rolling down my cheeks. I felt my pelvic outlet open, and then I pushed. My body, physically, of its own volition, bared down and out. I dropped my right knee into an asymmetrical lunge, leaned forward into the fur-covered window seat wall in front of me, and reached down, cry-moan grunting as I birthed my energetic son. I was sobbing now, overcome with emotion, and laid my energy baby on the floor. I leaned my head back and just began to cry out my baby, my sweet baby, over and over. Then I leaned forward and pressed my forehead to his, my tears falling on his cheeks, my breath filling his lungs, and me breathing in his breath. After a few moments here, I sat back, leaning against the wall, and picked up my etheric child and brought him to my chest, still laughing, weeping, and speaking to him in the way of mothers when their babe first emerges from their bodies into the world. I let the tears flow and focused on my breath, in and out, release. Eyes closed, I brought my energy baby to my right breast, and he nestled and rooted and latched. Sweetness. Suddenly, in my mind's eye, a second, smaller baby was held in my left arm and latched at my left breast. My firstborn, my wolf's son. The tears came harder, and I tried to breathe deeper through the tears as I held them both. Their cords swept down my belly between my legs, and I again felt the full belly bearing down of a contraction, and I silently pushed out their placentas. On the right, a large, full-term placenta, and on the left, a small, preterm placenta, both purple and full of life. I cried more, I laughed, I wept, I breathed slow and deep. My babies, my sweet boys, my perfect sons, I said aloud to them over and over. They reached for each other like twins in my mind, their arms stretching across the center of my chest to touch the other, one arm small and one arm larger. Both with their olive skin and head of black hair, identical in all ways but in size. In my vision, I scooped up their 2 placentas and placed them in a clay bowl, and then I opened my eyes, and carrying my babies and their first mothers, I heaved my shaking, vibrating body onto the lounge chair, propped myself up and nestled myself under a blanket. Both babies laid down my belly, each at one breast, their cords entwined into my side, and I cried more, and I let my knees fall open and my thighs shake, and I began to say, "We did it. We're okay now. We did it. We're okay now." After a while, I felt I needed to begin reorienting my nervous system and ground. I started with the self-hug to get oxytocin flowing, saying, I love you both," out loud. "We're okay. We did it. I love you so much." Then I sang. I sang through my tears, voice shaking, but I held them and I sang our lullaby, the river song from the movie The Prince of Egypt, when she places Moses in the basket and gives him to the water. When the song ended, I felt a sense of closure and more grounded in my physical body, not so much in that alternate realm of birth and spirit, so I switched to the cross-arm alternate tapping maneuver on my upper arms, which then turned into brushing down each arm to soothe, then brushing and flicking off the energy from each hand. I alternate stepped each foot on the couch, tapping on each thigh as I stepped. Then I sat up and pressed all over my body that I could reach with both palms from head to feet. I followed this event with making sure to drink water and eat food to finish grounding my body and spirit in the earthly human realm. I had gotten to rebirth my sons, my first and second born, in a new way, in a wild, instinctual way, in my home. They got to meet each other as brothers in a way they did not get to in life. I got to myth-mend their birth stories physically in the memory of my soft animal body that had birthed them and had been traumatized all those years ago. My body remembered, my body told its story, and my body got to make a new story, a story of healing and closure. With both of their real-life labors, I had had back labor pains, traumatic hospital births, and neglected, difficult postpartum periods. My first, nearly 16 years ago, was preterm and almost born at home accidentally during the swine flu epidemic because no one believed me that I was having contractions. In the delivery room, it was decided to break my waters as there was a concern for uterine infection, and I quickly pushed him out flat on my back with my legs held up. I ended up with ligament damage in my left hip from the way I pushed against the nurse holding my leg that took a long time to heal. He was immediately whisked away to another hospital not to be seen or held for 3 days for need of infectious isolation. When I was with him, they rarely wanted to let me hold him at the NICU because it was too much bother for the staff to set up skin-to-skin for me. He died there, 2 weeks later, without me, after no one believed me that I knew something was wrong 3 days prior. My second, almost 13 years ago, they forced me to push in the worst position, half sitting up, forced me to push through my screaming that I could feel myself tearing open, and forced me to push when my body wasn't ready. That resulted in a second-degree tear that required nearly 24 stitches to repair, and she stitched me back together too tight, so that I experienced vaginal pain constantly until the birth of my daughter 3.5 years later. My first, I never got to nurse. My second was also separated from me right after birth for no reason and didn't latch for the first time until he was almost 24 hours old. We went on to have a long but difficult nursing relationship, and I had severe unmanaged postpartum depression after both deliveries. I thought that the home free birth of my daughter, my third child, had healed those past births. It, in many ways, had healed physical harm done to my body with my second, and in many ways was emotionally healing and empowering in its own right. Through her birth, I had reclaimed my body, reclaimed my autonomy, and reconnected to my soft animal self, my baby, my intuition, and my ancestors in ways that I had not been allowed to with the others. I was able to have a non-traumatic, empowering, totally autonomous birth experience. But I hadn't realized the trauma that was still stored in my body, in my hips, in my bones, in my tissues, in my nervous system from so long ago, through and after my third birth. This is how deep and how long these traumas can be held in the body, and this is the healing power of intentional psychedelic mushroom medicine and somatic experiencing. After this experience, I began to explore this medicine and somatic work methodology deeper in myself and with others in my midwifery, bodywork therapy, and shamanic healing practice to release these deeply held birth traumas and to experience a rebirthing, birth story myth-mending, but in the neurophysiological memory of the body if possible. I don't know if this specific experience is reproducible, but there's only one way to find out. If you're interested in working with psilocybin and plant spirit medicine within a shamanic framework with a shamanic practitioner as your guide for whole mind, body, spirit healing work, please reach out via email at bearwomanwisdom@pm.me or at bearwomanwisdom.com to book a shamanic healing or plant spirit medicine session or a free discovery call to learn more. To learn more about myth-mending, somatic trauma work, and undisturbed birth, check out the work of Krista Arias, my first unmidwifery mentor and permaculture design instructor, who introduced me to this work many eons ago at Tierra Soul. Find a somatic experiencing trained practitioner for one-to-one SE trauma resolution coaching sessions at Somatic Experiencing International and the Embody Lab. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast episode. If you feel called to autonomous, traditional, and holistic support on your journey, please visit www.bearwomanwisdom.com to learn more about my full-spectrum reproductive and naturopathic wellness offerings, upcoming classes and workshops, both online and in person, online resources such as digital ebooks, and my herbal apothecary.